In this context video for Julian and Margery, we're going to get to some of the really interesting, important stuff about their cultural context that will help us to make sense of their very interesting pieces of writing. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is what we could call a kind of religious trend that was incredibly prominent in late 14th and 15th century England. And that trend is this word affective piety. Now, to explain what this means, I'm going to use two examples. Throughout time, in the faith of Christianity, Jesus has always, of course, played a central role. But throughout time, the way different people in different times have understood Jesus' sacrifice for Christians has changed, has been kind of altered. The first model I want to talk about in terms of how Jesus' sacrifice was understood, this is a long way of saying what theologians refer to as atonement theory. The first atonement theory that I want to talk about is a previous model known as Christus triumphans. That's Latin for the triumphant Christ. And I'm hoping the words come back. Yes, there they are. Now, this is kind of a Beowulf era atonement theory. And you can see some of the features of this triumphant Christ model in this crucifix on the left. Here we see a kind of stoic, muscular Christ who is being sacrificed for the sins of humankind, but does not seem to find it very difficult. This is not hard for Jesus. You know, he's very muscular, he's very unfazed by the fact that he is nailed to a cross, and this is just no problem. He can handle this. He's a big hero, kind of like Beowulf is this big hero who never suffers or will never admit to that suffering. So that's an earlier model of atonement theory. By the time we get to the 14th and 15th centuries, an entirely different atonement theory has kind of swept the fad. That's not a sensical phrase. It has kind of swept the land and become a fad in England. And that is the Christus Patiens model, or we can just call it affective piety. And we can see already how the differences might play out. I'm going to move my head so you can see this example of a Jesus who is suffering. You know, Christus Patiens means the suffering Christ. This is now where the emphasis gets placed on Christ's sacrifice, not his invincible heroicism, his unfazed, invincible stature, but the degree to which he suffered for humankind becomes the new focus of atonement theory. And so there's a clear focus on all of the different kind of tribulations and torture that Christ experienced as he was dying on behalf of the world. And we can see the way his suffering is put on display in this particular image of the crucifixion. We see the suffering of those around him, those who are witnessing his suffering, and we see his own suffering clearly through an emaciated body, the dripping of blood, and the wound that he puts on prominent display. Pay attention to the wound. We're going to be coming back to that in the theme section. Okay. So here's another example of affective piety. This is a wooden sculpture from Germany called the Röntgen Pietà. And you can again see the way we have an emaciated, suffering Christ being mourned by an incredibly inconsolable Mary. So affective piety places an emphasis on meditating on, imagining, and reliving the suffering of Christ, sharing in his suffering. And because it focuses on embodied experience, you know, suffering is an embodied thing, it's deeply sensual in nature. It focuses on embodied experience, but it can also focus on sexual experiences, which we'll see more clearly in Margery Kempe. And the premise of affective piety is that we can know, understand, and grow close to God through both the imaginative participation in Christ's suffering and the connection of our own physical embodied suffering to Christ's suffering. So this is really key to understanding why Julian would focus so much on a vision she has of Christ bleeding in front of her. Why would she do that? Affective piety is really key to why she would do that. It's also key to why Margery Kempe insists on having a very intimate emotional relationship with Jesus, because of the nature of affective piety. Okay, I'm going to pause there before moving on to the second part of this context video.